The hammer of the suppressed Glock clicked back, a sound that should have signaled the end of the White Lotus Syndicate. In the sterile, gold-leafed silence of the VIP vault, Baek Do-yun didn't look like a man about to die. He looked like a man bored by the inconvenience of the 5 muzzles aimed at his heart. A single cut on his forehead traced a line of crimson down his temple, staining the collar of his perfectly tailored black suit, yet his posture remained as upright as if he were presiding over a board meeting. He adjusted his silk tie with a steady hand, accepting the betrayal of his inner circle with a cold, terrifying dignity that made the gunman's hands tremble. Then, the heavy airtight seal of the vault hissed open, and the heavy atmosphere of execution was punctured by the mundane rattle of a silver serving tray. Jada Brooks stepped into the room with the practiced, invisible grace of a career waitress. Her uniform, a crisp white shirt and black vest, was immaculate, a sharp contrast to the violence staining the room. She was 30, composed, and wore a neutral expression that suggested she was more concerned with the temperature of the wine than the 5 guns drawn in her presence. The lead gunman, a rogue lieutenant with sweat beading on his upper lip, didn't even turn his head. He saw only a piece of the club's expensive furniture with a pulse. "Out," he snapped in a voice tight with adrenaline. "Wrong room, girl. Forget you saw this and you might live to see sunrise." Jada said nothing. Her dark, focused eyes didn't flicker toward the exits. Instead, they swept the vault with a predatory calculus that would have paralyzed the men if they had the wit to recognize it. 2 shooters at 10 o'clock, 1 at 3. Lead gunman has a heavy trigger finger, the 5th is standing in the blind spot of the vault door. She noted the way Do-yun held his breath, not in fear, but in anticipation. Annoyed by her stillness, the youngest gunman stepped toward her, his face twisted in a sneer. He reached out and backhanded the silver tray, sending the vintage wine bottle and the crystal glass shattering across the marble floor. The sound of breaking glass rang out like a starting pistol. Jada didn't flinch. She simply exhaled, a long, weary sigh that seemed to shed years of civilian life. When she looked up, the waitress was gone. In her place stood a cleaner who saw the world in strike points and terminal velocities. The young gunman never saw her move. 1 second he was gloating, the next, Jada had closed the distance with a blur of motion. She didn't use a gun. She used the jagged remains of the wine bottle with the surgical precision of a Mossad ghost. A single, fluid strike caught the man in the soft tissue of the throat before he could even register the shift in the air. He collapsed without a sound, his life pooling on the white marble. The vault plunged into a silence so heavy it felt physical. For assassins stared at their brother in arms, now a heap of meat at the feet of the woman in the black vest. The murderous confidence in their eyes evaporated, replaced by the primal realization that they had brought handguns to a fight against a monster. "Take her down," the lieutenant screamed, his voice cracking. "Kill the waitress first." 3 barrels swung toward Jada, but the math had already changed. If you're new to the channel and the math of this encounter just changed for you, don't let the story end here. Hit that like button if you felt the tension in that vault, and subscribe to join our syndicate of viewers. We deliver high-stakes action and captivating stories every day that you won't find anywhere else. Now, let's see what happens when the ghost is finally cornered. The silence that followed the carnage in the vault was heavier than the gunfire had been. Jada stood amidst the ruins of the vintage wine and the 5 men who had dared to spill it, her breathing shallow but perfectly regulated. She didn't look like a hero, she looked like a machine that had briefly flickered into life and was now cooling down. Do-yun didn't move. He sat in the high-backed leather chair, the blood from the cut on his forehead beginning to dry in a jagged line down his cheek. He didn't look at the bodies. He looked only at Jada, his dark eyes tracing the way she held the jagged neck of the broken bottle. "Your grip is different," Do-yun said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that cut through the ringing in her ears. 5 years ago, in the Macau harbor, you used a serrated blade. You were faster then, but less certain. Today, you are precise. Surgical." Jada's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. The waitress mask tried to stitch itself back together, but the fabric was torn. "I don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Baek. I'm just a club employee." I panicked. Do-yun stood up, the movement fluid and predatory. He stepped over the lead gunman's outstretched hand as if it were nothing more than a crack in the pavement. He stopped only when the tip of his polished shoe touched the hem of Jada's black skirt. You didn't panic, Jada Brooks, if that is the name you're using this month, he said, tilting his head. You intervened because you cannot help yourself. You were born to balance the scales. And I knew that if I placed enough weight on one side, the ghost would finally come out of the woodwork to fix it. Jada felt a cold sweat prickle her spine. You orchestrated this? You let your own men corner you, just to see if I'd move? A calculated risk, he admitted, reaching into his inner pocket to produce a small, encrypted tablet. He slid a file across the gold-leaf table. It was a grainy photo of a woman in the Mossad, her face half-shadowed, her eyes identical to the ones Jada wore now. I've spent 3 years and $4 million tracking the cleaner who spared my life in Macau. I didn't find you to kill you, Jada. I found you because the men who want me dead are the same men who signed your burn notice. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming the small space. The White Lotus is rotting from the inside. I need a shadow that doesn't belong to the Syndicate. I need a ghost. Jada looked at the broken glass in her hand, then at the man who had just gambled his life on a whim. And if I refuse? Do-yun smiled, a thin, lethal curve of the lips. Then I stop paying the people who keep your location off the Mossad's global server. We are both monsters, Jada. But together, we might just be the ones who survive the night. The transition from the relative safety of the club's kitchen to the sleek, armored interior of a Maybach felt like a descent into a deep-sea trench. Jada sat in the back seat, her waitress uniform replaced by a charcoal gray tailored blazer that felt like a suit of armor. In her hand, she held a sleek, titanium-encased smartphone, her new leash. Beside her, Baek Do-yun was a silhouette of sharp angles and expensive cologne, his eyes fixed on the rain-streaked window as Chicago's skyline blurred into a neon smear. Your role is simple, Do-yun said, his voice barely rising above the hum of the engine. You are my executive assistant for private relations. You sit in on every meeting. You stand behind me at every meal. You do not speak. You do not react. You simply listen to the room. Jada looked at her reflection in the darkened glass. The woman staring back wasn't a waitress, but she wasn't the ghost of Macau either. She was something in between, a weapon being polished for a final, desperate strike. You're asking me to be a human lie detector. You know I can't turn it off, don't you? The way a man's pulse jumps when he lies, the way his pupils dilate when he's holding a blade. That is exactly why you are worth the millions I am paying to keep you hidden, Do-yun replied, finally turning to look at her. The cut on his forehead was a dark, jagged mark of survival. The men in my circle have learned to hide their intent from me. But they won't hide it from a woman they perceive as my secretary. They will be careless. The car slowed as it approached the service entrance of the White Lotus headquarters, a monolith of glass and steel that housed 1,000 secrets. As the heavy iron gates hissed open, Jada felt the weight of her choice. To protect her anonymity, she was stepping back into the very heart of the violence she had spent years trying to scrub from her skin. They stepped out into the subterranean garage, where a phalanx of guards bowed in synchronized precision. Among them were the men Jada would have to sift through, the loyal, the ambitious, and the deadly. She fell into step half a pace behind Do-yun, her eyes already scanning the perimeter, noting the grip of the guards on their submachine guns and the subtle shifts in the shadows. Welcome back, Chairman, a man with silvering hair and a forced smile said, stepping forward. This was Elder Kong, the Syndicate's treasurer. Jada didn't look at his face. She looked at his hands. They were steady, but the slight tension in his radial artery told a different story. The air in the service entrance was cold, smelling of oil and old blood, and as the elevator doors closed them in, Jada knew the quiet life was dead. The game had begun. The ballroom of the Drake Hotel was a sea of shimmering silk and whispered conspiracies, illuminated by chandeliers that dripped like frozen rain. To the elite of Chicago's underworld, it was a fundraiser for a prestigious children's hospital. To Jada, it was a tactical grid. She stood exactly 3 inches behind Do-yun's left shoulder, clad in the charcoal blazer that marked her as his shadow. In her hand, she held a glass of mineral water she never intended to drink, her eyes moving with the rhythmic, detached precision of a radar sweep. Do-yun was the sun around which the room orbited, his presence magnetic and dangerous. He laughed at the jokes of corrupt politicians and shook the hands of men who had likely paid for the hit in the vault, his composure absolute. But Jada felt the slight tension in the air, the broken glass theory of her training. In a room of perfect reflections, she wasn't looking for the cracks, she was looking for the people who didn't belong in the mirror. "There," she whispered, her voice a ghost of a sound meant only for Do-yun's ear as he toasted a real estate mogul. "Which one?" Do-yun murmured back, his smile never wavering. "The waiter at the East Buffet. The woman in the emerald gown by the balcony. The photographer near the stage," Jada said. "They aren't looking at the money, and they aren't looking at you. They're looking at the exits. They have no visible weapons," Do-yun noted, his eyes scanning the trio she had identified. To any other observer, they were perfect guests. "It's not the weapons," Jada countered, her pulse steady. "It's the rhythm. Everyone else in this room moves with the syncopated beat of a party, shifting weight, gestures of social anxiety, the sway of the music. Those 3 move in a 4-4 tactical march. They are counting steps. They are clearing sight lines. They are moving like soldiers in a ballroom." The woman in emerald adjusted her glove, a movement so slight it was almost imperceptible, but Jada saw the way her elbow flared, a muscle memory of checking for a sidearm that wasn't there. The rhythm was wrong. The air around them felt brittle, like glass pushed to its breaking point. Jada's hand tightened almost imperceptibly around her glass. She wasn't just a waitress anymore, and she wasn't just a secretary. She was the only person in the room who could hear the silence beneath the music. "Wait for my lead," Do-yun said, his voice dropping into a lethal register. "I've already cleared the path to the service elevator," Jada replied, her gaze locking onto the photographer, who had just reached into a camera bag that was far too heavy for a lens. "The math is changing again, Do-yun. We have 12 seconds before the music stops." The penthouse was a cathedral of glass and shadow, far above the sirens of the city. The adrenaline of the fundraiser had ebbed, leaving a hollow, ringing silence in its wake. Do-yun sat on the edge of a velvet ottoman, his charcoal suit jacket discarded on the floor, the sleeves of his white shirt rolled to his elbows. The cut on his forehead had reopened during their hurried exit, a thin trail of crimson tracing the line of his jaw. Jada moved with the practiced quiet of a ghost, kneeling before him with a first aid kit. The professional distance of the executive assistant remained in her posture, but her hands, as she dipped a cotton swab in antiseptic, were steady and soft. "You didn't need to take the lead in the stairwell," Do-yun said, his voice a low vibration in the dimly lit room. He didn't flinch as she pressed the swab to the wound. "My men were supposed to handle the perimeter." "Your men are loyal, but they are loud," Jada replied, her focus entirely on the laceration. "Loud gets you killed. Precision keeps you breathing." Do-yun looked at her then, not as a tool or a subordinate, but as a mirror. "You saw them before I did. The rhythm. You speak of it as if it's a song only you can hear. It's not a song. It's a burden," she murmured, eyes darting to his for a fraction of a second before returning to her work. "When you spend your life waiting for the glass to break, you stop seeing the beauty of the window. You only see the shards." Do-yun let out a short, mirthless breath. "Is that the price? To be unshakable, one must stop being human?" He reached up, his fingers hovering near the hand she used to tape the bandage, though he didn't touch her. "My father told me that a dragon head has no room for fear. But the weight of being a statue is heavier than the weight of being a man." Jada paused, the surgical tape tight between her fingers. She looked at the blood on her glove, his blood, and felt the static of his proximity. The world expects you to be a monster because it's easier to fear a monster than to understand a man. You stay cold because if you let the heat in, the whole empire melts. "And you?" Do-yun asked softly. "What happens when the waitress forgets how to pretend?" Jada leaned back, closing the kit with a sharp, metallic snap. The mask of the neutral professional slid back into place, but the air between them remained charged, brittle as the crystal they had left shattered on the ballroom floor. "I don't forget," she said, standing up and regaining her shadow-like height. "I just changed the math." She turned to leave, her silhouette fading into the darkness of the hall, leaving Do-yun alone with the silence and the stinging realization that his unshakable armor had finally found its first real crack. The scent of salt and industrial grease hung heavy over the port of Chicago, a sprawling landscape of rusted shipping containers and towering cranes. It was a wide-open wasteland, the kind of place where cover was an illusion and every shadow was a potential sniper's nest. Do-yun stood near the edge of the pier, his silhouette sharpened by the harsh beams of the shipyard's floodlights. He was there to meet a supplier, but Jada, perched 300 yards away atop a stack of steel crates, knew the meeting was a fiction. Through the thermal scope of her rifle, the world was a map of heat signatures and cold steel. She wasn't looking at the meeting, she was looking at the perimeter. "Movement at 4 o'clock, she whispered into the comms, her voice a flat, clinical drone. 3 men. High-velocity rounds. They aren't Syndicate, Do-yun. They're professional mercs. Status?" Do-yun's voice was steady, even as the supplier reached slowly for his waistband. "The math is bad," Jada replied, her finger ghosting over the trigger. "You're in a kill box. If I engage, I have to go hot. There's a global surveillance satellite passing over this sector in 90 seconds. If I fire now, my signature goes into a database I've spent years trying to erase." "Do what you must," Do-yun said. The first muzzle flash from the containers was the only signal she needed. Jada didn't just pull the trigger, she moved with a kinetic fluidity that defied the wide-open space. She suppressed the urge to take the easy, stationary shots. Instead, she vaulted from the crates, firing mid-air to take out the lead merc before rolling behind a concrete pylon. It was a display of surgical violence that was far too polished for a waitress or a secretary. She moved through the open docks like a ghost in a machine, utilizing blind spots in the shipyard's geometry that only a Mossad trained cleaner would recognize. Each shot was a muffled pop, followed by the silent collapse of a threat. But as she neutralized the final gunman near Do-yun's car, a red light blinked on her tactical HUD. Satellite overhead. She had stayed in the light too long. She had been too efficient, too perfect. For 6 seconds, her heat signature and biometric movement patterns were beamed to a server halfway across the world. She reached Do-yun's side just as the car door hissed open. Her breath was barely elevated, but her eyes were wide with a rare flicker of fear. "We need to move," she urged, shoving him into the back seat. "I just left a fingerprint in the sky." Do-yun looked at her, seeing the smudge of grease on her cheek and the lethal clarity in her gaze. He didn't ask about the danger, he only signaled the driver to floor it. Behind them, the docks fell back into silence, but the ghost was no longer invisible. The world was officially watching. The digital fingerprint Jada had left at the docks didn't take long to ignite a signal fire in Tel Aviv. Within 48 hours, the rhythm of Chicago had shifted. The professional assassins of the local syndicates were replaced by something far more terrifying, men in nondescript suits with the bored eyes of state-sponsored ghosts. Her former agency was in the city, and they weren't looking for a waitress. "They're here," Jada whispered as they slipped out the back of the White Lotus headquarters, bypassing the armored motorcade for a dented sedan that smelled of stale coffee and old upholstery. Do-yun didn't ask how she knew. He simply sat in the passenger seat, his hand resting near the hidden holster at his hip. "Where are we going?" "My penthouses are compromised." "To a place that doesn't exist on any syndicate map," Jada said, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. They ended up in a fading brick walk-up in Rogers Park, far from the neon-soaked glass of the loop. The apartment was small, smelling of lavender and old floorboards, with a sun-drenched alcove that looked out over a quiet, tree-lined street. There were no gold-leaf tables or velvet ottomans here, only a worn linen sofa and a bookshelf filled with novels Jada had never had the time to finish. It was the modest life she had mapped out in her mind during the long, blood-soaked nights in Macau. Do-yun stood in the center of the cramped living room, his presence making the ceiling feel lower, his expensive suit looking absurd against the backdrop of cheap floral wallpaper. He ran a finger over the edge of a ceramic mug on the counter. This was the dream, wasn't it? Not the missions. This. Jada closed the double locks on the door, her movements sharp and rhythmic. It was a fantasy. A place where the math was simple. Groceries, rent, sleep. No ghosts. The agency won't look here because they don't believe you're capable of wanting something this small, Do-yun said softly. He looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting the fading afternoon light. They think you are a weapon that only knows how to destroy. They don't realize you are trying to build a cage for the monster. Jada leaned her back against the door, the weight of the last 3 years finally pressing down on her shoulders. For the first time, the cleaner looked fragile. If they find us here, Do-yun, this place becomes a tomb. I've brought the war to my sanctuary. Then we make sure they don't find us, Do-yun replied, stepping closer until he was within her perimeter. He didn't reach for her, but the shadow he cast was protective. We are in the blind spot now. Let the world hunt for the ghost. For tonight, you are just a woman in an apartment, and I am just a man who owes her his life. The silence of the neighborhood was a stark contrast to the gunfire at the docks, but Jada kept her hand near her weapon. She had finally reached her dream, but she had to share it with a Mafia boss while her past waited in the shadows outside. The safe house was a memory now, a brief inhalation of peace before the final plunge. The Chicago Cultural Center was a labyrinth of marble and stained glass, humming with the forced laughter of the city's power brokers. Councilman Park stood at the center of the rotunda, his smile as sharp as the betrayal he had orchestrated. He believed Do-yun was dead or fleeing. He didn't realize the dragon head was already inside the gates, and he certainly didn't see the woman moving through the shadows of the mezzanine. Jada had traded her charcoal blazer for a floor-length backless gown of midnight silk. It was a tactical choice. The fabric hid the ceramic blade strapped to her thigh and the microtransmitter in her ear, while the open back proved to any suspicious eye that she wasn't carrying a standard firearm. She moved with the rhythm of the elite, her amber eyes scanning the security detail with a clinical, lethal hunger. In position, she whispered, her voice a vibration against her jaw. Proceed, Do-yun's voice crackled in her ear. He was on the floor below, a ghost in a tuxedo, moving toward the VIP balcony where Park was holding court. The purge was silent and surgical. Jada didn't use a gun, she used the environment. A rogue security chief was neutralized in a darkened courtroom with a single, nerve-shattering strike. 2 more of Park's personal mercs disappeared into the service corridors, silenced by the ceramic blade before they could reach for their radios. She was cleaning the board, removing the pieces so Do-yun could checkmate the king. Each move was a testament to her Mossad heritage, fast, invisible, and absolute. On the balcony, Do-yun stepped out of the shadows, the light of the Tiffany dome catching the cold steel of his gaze. Park's face drained of color, his glass of champagne trembling. He reached for his panic button, but Jada was already standing behind him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder like a polite acquaintance. The signal is jammed, Councilman, Jada murmured, her voice like velvet over a razor. And your men are unavailable. Do-yun didn't raise a weapon. He didn't need to. He simply placed a tablet on the railing, the screen glowing with the bank records and intercepted comms that linked Park to the aviary and the Syndicate's internal coup. It was a political execution more devastating than a bullet. You have 2 choices, Park, Do-yun said, his voice a low, melodic threat. You can jump from this balcony and maintain your family's honor, or you can stay here and watch as I dismantle every cent of your legacy before I turn you over to the woman standing behind you. She is very, very tired of hiding. Park looked from Do-yun's frozen mask to Jada's empty, ancient eyes. He saw the math. He saw that the waitress was gone, the dragon was back, and there was no room left for him in the equation. The room is clear, Jada reported, her gaze never leaving the back of Park's neck. The purge was complete. The monsters had reclaimed their city. The victory at the gala was a hollow triumph, a temporary ceasefire in a war that would never truly end as long as Jada Brooks and Baek Do-yun existed on a map. The Israeli agents were already repositioning, and the remnants of the White Lotus were hungry for a new head. To stop the cycle, they didn't need to win, they needed to vanish. The plan was set at the Syndicate's private airfield, a desolate strip of tarmac surrounded by marshland. A Gulfstream jet sat idling, its engines a-low, hungry growl in the pre-dawn mist. Inside the cabin were the two things the world used to track them, the hard drive containing Jada's Mossad biometric data and the ledger of Do-yun's international holdings. "If we do this, there is no going back," Do-yun said, standing at the edge of the runway. He had shed his tuxedo for a simple black sweater, looking younger and more vulnerable in the gray light. "The world will mourn a Mafia boss and hunt for a dead ghost. We will be ghosts of a different kind." Jada held the detonator in her hand, her thumb hovering over the recessed button. Her heart was a steady, rhythmic thrum, the only math that mattered now. "The waitress is already dead, Do-yun. And the cleaner died the moment she stepped into that vault to save you. This is just the burial." She looked at him, seeing the man who had gambled his empire for a shadow. The price of their freedom was everything they had spent their lives building. They had to die so that Elena and David, the names they had whispered in the Rogers Park apartment, could live. The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, the agency's tactical teams closing the net. Jada didn't panic. She waited until the first black SUV crested the horizon, ensuring they had witnesses for the final act. "Now," Do-yun whispered. Jada pressed the button. The explosion was a beautiful, terrifying bloom of orange and white that turned the mist into steam. The jet disintegrated in a roar of jet fuel and magnesium, a fireball that climbed hundreds of feet into the air. The shockwave rattled Jada's teeth and blew the heat against her skin, a baptism of fire that scorched away her past. The hard drive, the ledger, and the identities of Subject 7 and the Dragon Head were consumed in seconds. By the time the agents reached the burning wreckage, there was nothing left but charred metal and the smell of ozone. In the dense woods bordering the airfield, two figures moved through the shadows with the silent, synchronized rhythm of survivors. They didn't look back at the flames. They walked toward the tree line, leaving the monsters behind in the ash, moving toward a horizon where the math finally equaled zero. The whitewashed walls of the cliffside cafe in Santorini caught the morning light, turning the terrace into a sanctuary of salt and silence. The Aegean Sea stretched out below, a vast expanse of blue velvet that held no memories of blood or burning jet fuel. Here, the rhythm of the world was different, it was the slow pulse of the tide and the distant chime of church bells, far removed from the staccato violence of Chicago. A man climbed the stone steps with a leisurely, steady gait. He wore a simple linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that no longer shook from the weight of an empire. His hair was slightly longer, softened by the sea air, and the jagged scar on his forehead had faded into a silver memory. To the locals, he was Han, a quiet traveler who spent his mornings reading by the water. He stepped into the shade of the blue-canopied terrace and took a seat at the small wooden table in the corner, the one with the unobstructed view of the horizon. Maya emerged from the cool shadows of the interior. She moved with a fluid, balanced grace, but the predatory edge had been replaced by a grounded, peaceful stillness. Her hair was loose, catching the breeze, and her amber eyes were clear, no longer scanning for sightlines or exit routes. She carried a single cup of coffee on a small ceramic tray, the silver service of the VIP vault a lifetime away. She placed the cup before him, her hand steady and warm. There was no bow of a subordinate, no sharp calculation in her gaze. "Black, no sugar," she said, her voice a soft melody that finally matched the tranquility of the morning. "Thank you, Maya," Han replied, his voice a low, melodic rasp that held a hint of a smile. He didn't look at the coffee, he looked at her. For a moment, they simply existed in the space between them, the silence no longer heavy with secrets, but light with the possibility of a future. They were no longer the Dragon Head and the cleaner, nor the boss and the waitress. They were two survivors who had paid for their lives in fire and were now learning how to live them in the sun. Han reached out, his fingers brushing hers as she moved to take the tray. It wasn't a tactical anchor or a desperate hold, it was a simple, human connection. Under the table, no weapons waited in the shadows. The math had finally settled at 0. "What do you want to do today?" he asked, the question a promise. Maya looked out at the sparkling water, a long, peaceful exhale escaping her lips. "Something normal," she said. Han smiled, and for the first time, the expression reached his eyes. "I have absolutely no idea what that means." "Neither do I," she laughed, and the sound was foreign, beautiful, and hers. "Let's go find out." The math finally hit 0, and 2 monsters found their peace in the sun. But in the world of shadows, there is always another secret waiting to be uncovered. If you enjoyed Jada and Do-yun's journey from the vault to the coast, make sure to give this story a like and subscribe to the channel. We're building an empire of the most captivating tales on the platform, and you won't want to miss our next drop. Let us know in the comments, what was your favorite hidden skill moment? Until the next target, stay sharp, and thanks for watching.